First of all, Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to respond, which I'm not quite sure what sort of a role that is, the responder, but I'm going to try and reflect, I think, or react to some of the ideas that I believe were in Joe Mulholland's mind in organising this session, in particular today's theme, and the panel that he has put together. My immediate reaction to the three speakers is that I'm struck by a series of emotions. I'm very taken by the high seriousness with which they all approached the topic. I'm taken by their sense of impatience, which was utterly and absolutely palpable, by their commitment, which is obvious and quite clearly genuine, by their idealism, which is admirable, and I also think utterly and absolutely genuine, and I think probably the motivation that has brought them into politics. Clearly, too, by their obvious intelligence, by their capacity to reflect on their experiences. I hope they don't object if I say that I also felt that they were inspirational, that they inspired. And they left me with a sense of pride and optimism for the future. The three of them quite clearly do not correspond to the typical stereotype of the politician that is presented so often in the media, and who was pilloried here last night by a number of contributors. The paid professional politician on the make, subject to the draconian disciplines of the whip, having forfeited their individuality and their sense of consciousness. So that's my reaction to these three speakers. It makes me reflect, of course, about a number of the criticisms that I have had of the system myself, as to what extent these three performances allow my previous criticisms to stand up. And I'll reflect on that in a moment, if I may. What I'm very much taken by is the series of questions that precede this particular session, which is today's theme is the governance of the Republic. I always take what Joe Mulholland writes in this brief very seriously, and I examine it carefully because I think it sets the context inside which these responses, these presentations have been made, and which will now colour my own response. If you examine what he has written very carefully, you'll see that he has posed 7 questions about the future. He says, how do we generate genuine participation? How can we exclude cronyism and clientelism? How can we have a system that encourages civil engagement? How can we make local government work? And that's a theme that I'm going to come back to because it was in all 3 presentations. How can we have a healthy balance between the legislature and the executive, Joe asked. Again, is a theme that was in all 3 presentations. And how can we expand the role of the public representative and give it meaning? And how can we deepen our democracy and make it an instrument for progress? These are very extraordinarily profound questions, I believe, and they got, I think, full measure and were in the 3 presentations that we have had. I liked one of the points that was made by Egon, which was, I think, an essential starting point. He made the point that we live in a parliamentary democracy. That's easily overlooked. But a parliamentary democracy is the system that we have either chosen or have inherited, but it's the one under which we live. It's also sometimes called as a system of representative democracy. And so the representatives in Parliament, therefore, are key. These 3 people are key to the system. I think that raises then the first question which Joe has asked us to address, and upon which the 3 TDs have themselves reflected, and that is, how do we choose them? more fundamentally, is the electoral system, the one that we operate, is it the best system for choosing the best representatives in this parliamentary democracy? That has been debated innumerable times, including last year, where I gave a presentation on the electoral system. And I think, along with many others, would seriously call into question the utility of the single transferable vote. And it's certainly questionable as to whether it is or is not the best system for electing the best representatives. And I think many of the dichotomies, the tension between the national and the local, the sort of dilemma that Owen expanded on so eloquently, the tension between the national and the local. These, I think, are the consequence, direct and immediate consequence of the electoral system. Now, we want localism to be a continuing feature of our political system, then this is the best way of ensuring that it continues, to keep the present system. But I think it raises the question, and therefore I leave it hanging there, because I feel very strongly about it, but I'm not so sure that others would necessarily agree. Obviously, the opposite to a single transferable vote system is either the United Kingdom system of first past the post, or what is conventional in practically every other democracy inside the European Union, which is the list system, which is based on political parties. And you essentially, as an elector, vote for a political party rather than for an individual candidate. Now there are variations on that, including in Denmark, where you can actually vote for a candidate within a list. But basically, you're always voting for a political party. I think in parliamentary democracies, and this has come up over and over and again, is that the authority comes from the people, which is expressed in the Constitution, to the Parliament, in other words, to the politicians. And the politicians in Parliament elect the government under the Westminster model, which is the one that we have decided to operate. It's what we did instinctively in 1919. It's very well worthwhile reading sometimes the proceedings of the First Dáil, and they came up last night. A version of history that was offered that, to my mind, did not correspond with historical reality. But the First Dáil, as I say, which is now the subject, by the way, of continuing study by an association of former members of the Oireachtas, to which these three people ultimately will become members at some point. Not too soon, I hope. But we have been former members examining that First Dáil, and in fact we have held now seminars on 3 successive years on the 21st of January, each time the anniversary of the First Dáil. And we hold our seminars in Leinster House chamber, in the Dáil chamber itself, by permission of the Ceann Comhairle. And it is extraordinary just to look at how naturally the First Dáil slid or fell or simply adopted the Westminster model without debate, by the way. Now, is that the best model? Now, Catherine in particular raised this question because she offered the possibility of an executive system such as one would have in France, and to a certain extent, but not quite, in Finland. It's a very good question, because if you have this direct responsibility between government and parliament, then you have the problems that both Egon and Owen were particularly looking at, and indeed Catherine herself reflected on the whip system. Because the loss of a vote, depending on how significant that vote is believed to be, can lead to an immediate general election. Numbers of us in this room will remember Jimmy Kemmy voting in a particular way on budget night about VAT on shoes. Government gone straight away. I was locked into a room writing a speech, and somebody was outside for 20 minutes trying to hammer the door down to get in to tell me that the government that I was supposed to defend had gone. And we were now into a general election, and I better start writing different sorts of speeches and doing different type of things. And that is, as a former whip, as a former general secretary of a political party, who ensured that the whip was applied, for which I make no apology when you're in government, that is hanging over you all the time. That sword of Damocles is hanging over you all of the time. Okay, maybe you can say the present government, given the size of its majority, not so much. But if you're operating on a 2 or 3 majority vote, believe you me, it's there constantly. I think A way out of this is, and it's the other question that came up all of the time, is how does Parliament exercise then control over government if you're not in the position, if you don't want to be in the position of bringing down the government through constructive dissent? I remember myself and Barry Desmond, when we were both backbenchers, did this on a particular measure. Barry Desmond, whom those of you who would remember him, let us say he was never short of a word and could speak at great length on practically any topic, usually and very, very well informed. And we both of us did this. And the next day, we both figured as the lead headline in the Irish Independent, and it was then abroad, but in the broadsheet version. And I looked at the headline, and I went and I talked to the journalist, and I said, "An rud is anat is iontach." Never again am I speaking out against government, even though I feel I should on occasion, but I'm not going to, because this is what happens as a consequence, and I am not going to weaken this government, no matter what happens. So how do you get out of that sort of dangerous relationship? And I think the key to it is something that the three deputies have constantly reiterated themselves throughout their presentations, which is the role of committee. Because in committee, you can have, it's a non-confrontational situation, not a do or die, there's not the sword of Damocles, as I said earlier, hanging over the government if it loses a vote. In committee, as distinct from, by the way, the Dáil being a committee in the Dáil chamber, I'm talking about a committee of the Dáil operating somewhere else, over in Setanta House or wherever. And I think that's it. The problem about the committee system being fully functional is that the deputies has got to have the time to spend in the committee. An issue that Owen brought out graphically, particularly in that wonderful comic piece of writing about the backbencher. The fundamental problem is you cannot be in two places at the one time, and you cannot do two things at the one time. Committee work requires professionalism, application, dedication, lots of time to research, to do the sort of work that he was talking about, to have read the bill, to have discussed it with experts. That type of work we don't have in our system. And that, if you like, it's the professional parliamentarian as distinct from the politician that we need. Now, I believe there's a direct causal relation or correlation between the electoral system and the committee system. And you get a better parliament, in my view, if you have a strong committee system. You'll only get a strong committee system if you have members who can work it. And the only way they can work it is being released from the tyranny of the constant campaign and all the clinic work. That's what I think. So the question never is, what is the best model? And interestingly enough, about Parliament, there was no reference by either of the three deputies to two issues that are worthy of consideration. And one is to whether or not our Parliament should be fixed term, which would take away the sword of Damocles to a certain extent, and as to whether or not there should be outside experts brought into government, as in some other member states inside the EU. There's a strong argument for that. On the other hand, it certainly weakens the nature of the Parliament, of the Westminster model that we have consciously chosen for ourselves, that members of the government are drawn from those who have been elected to the Parliament. The other thing that came across, and I think most powerfully, I'm sure that all of us would agree in listening to the three contributions, was this constant referencing back to community, the community basis as the foundation upon which the system should rest. I think that what would distinguish a republic is that power should flow from the bottom up to people, rather than as in a monarchical system where it comes, or a dictatorial system where it comes from the bottom down. And I think that Catherine's contribution in particular here was very profound in the way in which she analysed the nature of communities, and I think made a powerful point that of the enormous energies and talents and creativity that there are within communities, which, if released, could transform many of the ways in which we do things. And it's been a passion of mine for over 40 years, and I have to say that the government with which I was most closely associated with, I feel the greatest sense of shame in that the worst document that we produced during those years was about the reform of local government. And I've argued practically with every Minister for Local Government since about profound reform along the French lines, think of it that if we had a mayor, say for Glenties and the tiniest village here in County Donegal, as they would have in France, and the same proportion of the way in which France is organised, we would have 3,500 mayors with executive responsibility in their own areas, and also with a certain element of tax-raising capacity. Again, the point that Catherine made. And she talked about how responsible communities are if they are given the chance to be so. I think that would transform the way in which we run our society, and also would transform our economy. I can't prove that what I'm going to say now is I have just an instinct that it would add somewhere between 1 to 2% to GDP growth every year if you had that complete reformation of local government. Last thing I want to say is that there has been reference to the public service, there's been reference to permanent government. There's a great element of truth in that. That needs to be very seriously looked at. There was reference last night to the whole question of ENA and the formation and transformation of the public service. So let me conclude by saying that if you look at the agenda that is ahead of us as a people, sort of 5 big issues which have and have not come into the 3 presentations this morning, certainly come in last night to a certain extent. The future of the European Union, our own role within it, the future of the Eurozone, our place within inside the Eurozone, its relationship with the European Union as a whole, and as a subset of all that as a problem, the future of the United Kingdom inside the European Union, and the economic effects of any decision that they might have to step aside. There's a whole question of climate change, which, to my view, is the biggest challenge facing not just this country, but all the global community. And particularly, this is an issue for younger people, but we really do stand in danger of actually burning this planet and having climate change go beyond the point where it's irretrievable. The World Bank has just published a report which is called Stop the Warming, which analyses the effect of a 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature caused by global warming. And it's quite frightening. It was written by Professor Schellenhuber from the Potsdam Institute, with whom we have a very strong working relationship. There's the question of the rise of China. By the end of this century, we will all, those of us living, not me, will be living in a completely transformed world, which will be dominated by China, which will probably account for somewhere between 30 to 40% of global GDP. And 1.5 billion people is going to bring with it its own problems that are inevitable given human nature. The other thing that we need to do, and here Aegon was talking about the new proclamation, new start. You know, we were saved once before by civil servants, by Ken Whittaker. Whittaker's great book of 1958, and it was led on to economic planning. And he set out an economic model for development. That model has run its course. It no longer functions. It's no longer applicable. It's no longer the one that we should be pursuing. The question is, what one should we be pursuing? There's a great deal of thought required to be done on this. That's a half a century ago since Whittaker, who is still alive, did that. Now, I think that would be an enormous agenda for deputies such as these 3 and their colleagues to confront and to work on. And I would hope that it would produce something equivalent of Whittaker. Big venue. End as I began, I felt very proud of these 3 public representatives. This is not a broken society when you look at them.